Us this morning to discuss the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and several other pressing issues is Republican Congressman from Florida, Mike Waltz. He's a combat decorated Green Beret and a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, grateful that you're sharing part of your weekend with us. So the Armed Services Committee received a classified briefing on the situation in Ukraine earlier this week. Up to this point, have you seen any evidence that Vladimir Putin can be persuaded against an invasion of Ukraine?
In that briefing, there was bipartisan frustration. I think in my visit, which was also a bipartisan trip to Ukraine a month ago, there was frustration at just how slowly this lethal aid has been moving in. And meanwhile, during these negotiations, which I think Putin is really putting on for show for his domestic political propaganda, we have seen massive amounts of tanks, planes, and ships moving from east to west to the Ukrainian border. And it's not just the numbers, it's the types of troops. Many of them are from his reserves and National Guard, which are primarily intended for occupation duty. So I do think this invasion is imminent. And we have to look at why Putin is doing it now. He's doing it because he got away with it in 2014 under the Obama administration. He's doing it because he has achieved his top foreign policy priorities and an extension of the New START nuclear arms agreement at the beginning of this administration with no concessions, but also the attack on the colonial pipeline with really no retribution. And then, of course, Afghanistan, which I think was incredibly damaging, devastating, really, to American credibility. So at the end of the day, and we can't forget the Nord Stream 2 pipeline coming online, which will then allow Putin to bypass Eastern Europe and Ukraine while maintaining oil and gas, some of which is the dirtiest form of gas in the world, to head into to Western Europe, which will compromise any type of unified response.
Congressman, you mentioned Afghanistan, and I specifically want to pull that thread because, 20 years of war and a messy withdrawal, I don't think many Americans are eager for foreign conflict, and there's a lot going on domestically that consumes the attention of our friends, families, and neighbors. So why should Americans watching right now pay attention to what's happening in Ukraine, and how far do you think the U.S. should go to prevent an incursion?
Well, global stability has been underscored and supported by American leadership since World War II, backed by diplomatic and military power. And if in the course of a year, two major allies where we've had significant investment, both Afghanistan and Ukraine, are taken over by a terrorist regime and by Russia, Americans should care because China's watching, North Korea's watching, Iran is watching, and our Eastern European allies are incredibly concerned and watching. Authoritarianism is on the march when they believe that this White House doesn't have the political will to utilize American power. And our alliances are America's greatest strength. And right now, I think that our credibility to support them is under great strain.
So how far should the United States go in protecting Ukrainian sovereignty?
Well, look, nobody is calling for hundreds of thousands of American boots on the ground, but I think there's a lot more we can and should be doing to support Ukraine. This lethal aid should have been moving faster. They've been asking for it for months, and it's just now arriving. And it's the types of lethal aid. The thing the Russians most fear are those surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship missiles. They're called Harpoon missiles. Again, the Ukrainians have been asking for them, and there is a real sense of the White House not wanting to provide it because they don't want to provoke Putin. I think that's the exact opposite approach. It actually emboldens Putin. The other piece is a strong statement from the president that we will continue to support any type of Ukrainian resistance. We need to be focused on deterrence on the front end to complicate Putin's calculus, to stop him up front, not talking about the response we're going to have after he invades. By then, it will be too late, just as it was in 2014. So again, I think we need a real policy shift towards deterrence first, rather than aggressive response. And at the end of the day, sanctions have to be in both euros and dollars. And as long as Germany, the strongest economy in Europe, is dependent on Russia for its gas to heat its homes, I don't think you're going to see a strong response. Russia knows it, and that's why they're not deterred by just a sanctions first approach.
Mike, I do want to ask you about the legislation that you introduced this week, specifically aimed to target the International Olympic Committee, given that China is hosting an Olympics and simultaneously conducting a genocide against the Uyghurs. It's a bipartisan legislation that would strip the IOC of its tax-exempt status. How does that help Uyghurs, and why should Americans care about what's happening in Xinjiang?
Well, the IOC is tax exempt in the United States as a 501c4 social welfare organization. And if you look at what's happening in China right now as we speak, 1 million Muslims in concentration camps, forced rape, forced torture, forced labor, sterilizations, abortion that's going on, not to mention stamping out freedom in Hong Kong, Tibet, unleashing COVID on the world, covering it up, and threatening Taiwan. This is the last place the IOC should have been hosting the Olympics. We've been asking them to move it for years. And of course, we want our athletes to compete, but it's the IOC who's now put them in a position of ignoring their values and ignoring these atrocities in order to be able to compete. And then secondly, I'm very concerned about their safety. They've been told not to take phones, not to take laptops. China's a surveillance state, and not to speak out about any of this for fear of arrest. NBC itself isn't sending its broadcasters. I don't think this is a place we want to send young athletes. And then finally, on the tax status, that NBC contract alone is $7.5 billion, and the IOC is sending $800 million into Beijing for its infrastructure. Again, the American taxpayer should not be subsidizing an organization that rightly took a stand against apartheid in South Africa for 30 years and banned any Olympics there, but is turning a blind eye to genocide. And the only difference, it really is the amount of money involved. And enough is enough. We need to take a moral stand in line with our values and our morals.
Well, I want to press you there, Congressman, because in announcing the bill, you note that, quote, the corporate partners for the 2022 Genocide Olympics should be ashamed to be associated with the IOC and the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda ploy. You list Coca-Cola as one of those sponsors, one of many, yet that company, along with several others that profit mightily from China, also make large political contributions. Kevin McCarthy's Leadership PAC got $5,000 from Coke last election cycle. Coke donated some $2 million to different political campaigns during that cycle. Would you be willing to renounce donations affiliated with corporations that are profiting from China?
I will certainly renounce any that are sponsoring this Genocide Olympics. And by the way, they've lobbied heavily to kill an amendment to the defense bill that I had that said they shouldn't be making millions off of defense contracts, but then pumping billions into China's military buildup through its civil military fusion. You know, where is a level of corporate patriotism here? And many of these companies preach social justice and good corporate governance here. They want to boycott Major League Baseball in Georgia and take other stands here. Well, that doesn't just stop at America's shores, particularly when you have an ongoing genocide as defined by multiple administrations, and including this State Department. Again, when it comes to women's rights, when you have mass rape, sterilization, and abortion campaign going on, that is gross, disgusting. These companies should be ashamed of themselves, and I certainly wouldn't take a dollar from them.
Plenty more questions to ask. Unfortunately, we got to leave the conversation there. Congressman Mike Waltz, appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Of course. Stay with CNN. We'll be right back.